The sky cracked open before I even reached my car. I remember the sound most of all. Not thunder, not quite. Thunder rolls and fades. This was a single, sharp snap, like something enormous had been torn in half, far above the clouds, and then the rain came down so hard I could barely see the parking lot in front of me. I had my collar up, my keys already in my hand, and I was running the last few steps to my car when a flash of green light passed low across the sky, fast, gone before I could even turn my head toward it. I stopped where I stood. Water ran down my neck and soaked through my shirt, but I didn't move for a moment. People around me in the lot were shouting about the storm, ducking into their cars, slamming doors. Nobody else seemed to notice the light. Maybe it was heat lightning. Maybe it was a plane catching the last of the sun through the clouds. I told myself that, because the alternative made no sense, and I had a long drive home and no patience left for questions I couldn't answer. My name is Daniel Hart. That night, I was 31 years old, working long shifts at the harbor loading yard, and I had exactly one thing on my mind, which was getting home before the storm turned the coastal road into a river. I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled out onto the main road with the wipers fighting a losing battle against the rain. The drive along the coast takes about 20 minutes if the weather is decent. That night, it took longer, because visibility dropped to almost nothing past the second turn, and I had to slow the car to a crawl. The road runs close to the cliffs there, close enough that on a clear day you can see the water crashing against the rocks far below. That night I could see nothing but gray static beyond my headlights. That was when I saw the second flash. It was closer this time, low over the tree line to my right, and it wasn't gone in an instant like the first one. It dropped, curved, and vanished behind the ridge with a flicker of pale blue light that lit the underside of the clouds for half a second. My hands tightened on the wheel. I told myself it was a transformer blowing somewhere, a power line coming down in the wind. That happened often enough on this stretch of coast during storms. I almost convinced myself. Then I heard the sound. It came from the trees, a long, low hum that didn't belong to any storm I had ever driven through. It rose and fell like something breathing, and underneath it I heard a thinner sound, sharper, almost like a voice, though I couldn't have told you what language it belonged to, if it was a language at all. My foot came off the gas without me deciding to lift it. The car slowed to a stop on the shoulder of the road, rain hammering the roof, and I sat there for a long moment with my heart going harder than it had any right to. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it would have been easy and safe to keep driving. Nobody would have blamed me. It was late, the storm was bad, and whatever was happening in those trees was none of my business. I could have gone home, made dinner, and forgotten the whole thing by morning. Instead, I turned off the engine and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit me first, sharp and immediate, soaking through my jacket within seconds. I left the headlights on, angled toward the trees, and walked into the tall grass at the edge of the road. The humming sound grew louder as I moved closer, and beneath my boots I felt something strange, a faint vibration in the ground itself, steady, like a heartbeat too large to belong to anything I understood. I found the source about 30 meters into the trees, in a shallow gouge cut fresh into the earth, black soil thrown up in a ring around a scorched patch of ground. There was no fire, no wreckage that I could see clearly through the rain and the dark, just a strange, low light pulsing weakly from somewhere near the center of the disturbed earth. And there, curled against the base of a tree, soaked to the skin and shaking, was a child. At first, I thought she was human. The shape was right, small, thin limbs, dark hair plastered flat against her scalp by the rain. It was only when she lifted her head and looked at me that I understood she was not. Her eyes were too large for her face, and too dark, without any white around the edges, catching what little light there was, and holding it in a way that made my breath catch in my throat. Faint lines ran along her temples and down the sides of her neck, pale blue, almost silver, pulsing very slightly, like veins lit from within. Her skin had a gray undertone beneath the pallor of the cold, and her ears came to a soft point beneath her wet hair. She flinched hard when she saw me, pressing herself back against the tree, and made a small sound, thin and frightened, that needed no translation. I stopped where I was and raised both hands slowly, the way you might with a frightened animal, though even as I did it I felt foolish, because nothing about this made sense. My mind was cycling through explanations, a costume, a hoax, a trick of the stormlight, and rejecting each one as she stared at me with those enormous dark eyes, trembling so hard I could see it from where I stood. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, though I doubted she understood a word of it. My voice came out rough, barely audible over the rain. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't move. Neither did I. Not for a long moment. The rain kept falling, cold and relentless, running down both of us, and somewhere behind her, in the disturbed earth, that faint light kept pulsing weaker and weaker, like something dying. I crouched down slowly, closing the distance a little at a time, keeping my hands visible, keeping my voice low and even, the way I might speak to a child who had fallen and hurt themselves. She watched every inch of my movement, muscles coiled like she might bolt, but she didn't run. Maybe she had nowhere to run to. Maybe she was simply too cold and too frightened to move at all. Up close, I could see the state she was in more clearly, and it frightened me in a different way than the strangeness of her had. Her lips had gone a shade of gray-blue that I recognized from every winter safety talk I'd ever half listened to at the harbor. She was freezing. Whatever she was, whatever world she had come from, the storm didn't care, and neither did the cold. I was still holding my umbrella, useless until now, folded and forgotten in my hand since I'd stepped out of the car. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and held it out over her rather than myself, letting the rain hammer against the fabric instead of her small shoulders. She flinched again at the sudden movement above her head, then went very still, staring up at the underside of the umbrella like she couldn't quite understand what it was or why I had done it. "There," I said quietly. "That's better, isn't it?" She looked at me then, really looked, and something in her expression shifted. Not trust exactly, not yet, but a kind of confusion that seemed to ask a question she had no words for. Why? Why would I do this? I didn't have a good answer, not one I could have explained, even to myself in that moment. I only knew that she was small, and cold, and alone in the dark, and that felt like reason enough. I shrugged off my jacket next, wincing as the cold air hit my already soaked shirt, and held it out toward her the way you'd offer something to a stray animal, slow and unthreatening. She stared at the jacket, then at me, and after a long hesitation, reached out with a small gray hand and took it from my fingers without letting our skin touch. She wrapped it around her shoulders clumsily, still watching me the entire time. We stayed like that for a while, longer than I could say for certain, the rain drumming against the umbrella above us both, her huddled in my jacket, me crouched in front of her with my knees aching and my clothes soaked through. I tried a few more words, simple ones, my name, a question about where she'd come from, gestures toward the sky and back to her. She didn't answer, not with words, but she stopped shaking quite so hard. At some point, without warning, she reached out and pressed 2 fingers lightly against the back of my hand. It lasted only a second. A brief warmth spread up my arm, faint and strange, like static electricity, but softer, almost like a question being asked without sound. I didn't pull away, though every instinct told me to. Her dark eyes held mine the entire time, and for that 1 second, I had the strangest feeling that she was trying to understand something about me, some part of me a handshake or a smile could never explain. Then she pulled her hand back and stood, and before I could say anything else, she was moving past me into the trees, umbrella still held tight in one small hand, my jacket wrapped around her shoulders. "Wait," I said, rising too fast, my knees protesting. "Hold on. It's still." But she was already gone, swallowed by the dark and the rain and the trees, moving faster than I would have believed possible for someone who moments ago could barely stand. I took a few steps after her, calling out, though I didn't even know what name to call. The forest gave nothing back except the sound of rain hitting leaves, and somewhere behind me, that low pulsing light in the scorched earth finally going dark. I stood there for a long time after that, alone in the storm, my jacket gone, my umbrella gone, water running down my face and neck and back. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, ordinary and unremarkable, as though nothing strange had happened at all. I walked back to my car in a daze. I don't remember much of the drive home, only that I kept glancing at the rearview mirror and at the sky, half expecting to see that green light again. It didn't come back. By the time I reached my street, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and my porch light flickered weakly as I climbed the steps, soaked and shivering, and unable to explain to myself what exactly I had just witnessed. I told myself, standing under my own dry porch roof at last, that I would call someone in the morning. The police, maybe, or animal control, though even as the thought formed, I knew how it would sound. A frightened child with strange eyes and glowing skin vanished into the trees, and I had nothing to show for it but a missing jacket and an umbrella I would probably never see again. Nobody would believe me. I wasn't sure I believed myself. I went inside, peeled off my wet clothes, and sat for a long time at my kitchen table with a towel around my shoulders and a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, staring out the window at the dark street beyond. Once, just once, I thought I saw a flicker of pale green light pass low across the clouds far in the distance, gone before I could be certain I hadn't imagined it. I told myself it was heat lightning. I went to bed that night without much sleep, turning the same handful of images over and over in my mind: the scorched earth, the pulsing light, the small gray hand pressed against mine for a single strange second. By morning, in the ordinary light of day, with the storm past and the sun bright over the harbor, it was almost easy to believe none of it had happened at all. Almost. I had no way of knowing, lying awake that night listening to the last of the rain against my window, that somewhere far above the clouds, far beyond anything my eyes could reach, something had already begun to change. A signal had gone out. A name had been recorded. And somewhere among the stars, a mother, who had feared the worst for her missing daughter, was about to learn that her child was alive, and that a stranger on a small, unremarkable world had wrapped her in his own coat and stood between her and the cold without asking for anything at all. I didn't know it yet, but the umbrella I had given away in the rain was already on its way back to me, and it would not be coming back alone. The umbrella was sitting on my porch 3 weeks later, and I almost didn't notice it at first. I came home from a long shift at the harbor, tired in the way that settles into your shoulders and doesn't leave until you sleep, and there it was, leaning against my front door like it had always belonged there. I stopped on the top step and stared at it for a long moment, my keys forgotten in my hand. It looked the same, mostly, the same dark fabric, the same curved wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. But when I picked it up, I noticed the fabric had a faint sheen to it that hadn't been there before, a shifting quality in the light, like oil on water, and the metal ribs beneath the canopy felt heavier somehow, denser, though the umbrella itself weighed no more than it had when I bought it years ago. There was no note, no sign of who had left it or when. I checked the street in both directions and saw nothing but parked cars and the usual quiet of my neighborhood in the evening light. I brought it inside and set it by the door and told myself I was imagining the strangeness of it. Umbrellas got left places. Maybe a neighbor had found it somewhere and returned it, not realizing how far from home it had traveled. That explanation held together for about as long as it took me to open it once, indoors, out of habit more than anything, and watch the fabric ripple faintly, like it was breathing. I closed it quickly after that and didn't open it again for a long time. Life went on, the way it does even when something strange has cracked open somewhere just beneath the surface of things. I went back to work at the loading yard, hauling crates and checking manifests under the tall cranes that lined the harbor, and for a while I managed to convince myself that the night in the storm had been some kind of fever dream, a trick of exhaustion and bad weather and a little too much imagination. Peter Voss worked the crane station next to mine, and most mornings we grabbed coffee together before the first shipment came in. He was the sort of person who filled silence easily, always talking about something, football scores or his sister's wedding, or the state of the parking lot potholes, and most days I appreciated that about him. It gave me something to nod along to without having to think too hard. One morning, about a week after the umbrella reappeared, I made the mistake of asking him if he'd ever seen anything strange in the sky during a storm. He laughed before I even finished the question. Strange like what? Lightning? Not lightning, I said, and immediately regretted bringing it up. Never mind. Forget I asked. No, come on, now you have to tell me. He grinned around his coffee cup, clearly expecting some story about a drunk night or a shooting star mistaken for something else. When I gave him a vague, cleaned-up version, just lights in the clouds, nothing about the child, nothing about the umbrella, he shrugged and said he'd probably seen the same thing, some military test flight out over the water. They ran those sometimes, and never told anyone until after the fact. He moved on to talking about his sister's wedding again within a minute, and I let him, relieved not to have to explain any further, and a little unsettled at how easily I had lied by omission. I didn't tell him about the dreams. They started small, fragments more than anything coherent, a pair of dark eyes watching me from somewhere just out of reach, a low humming sound that vibrated up through my chest even in sleep. Some nights I woke with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that someone had been standing at the foot of my bed only a moment before, though the room was always empty when I opened my eyes, the door always closed, the house always silent except for the ordinary creaks of an old building settling in the night. I told myself it was stress. I told myself a lot of things that spring. The world outside my little stretch of coastline was changing too, though slowly at first, in ways that were easy to dismiss individually and harder to ignore once they started piling up. It began with the satellites. A news segment I half-watched over dinner mentioned that 3 separate communications satellites had gone dark within the same week, their signals cutting out without warning and never resuming, and nobody in the segment seemed to have a good explanation for why. The anchor, a composed woman named Emma Doyle, who I'd watched deliver the evening news for years without ever paying her much attention, moved through the story with the practiced calm of someone reading about a stock market dip rather than anything worth losing sleep over. Then came the interference. Ships along the coast, my own workplace included, started reporting strange bursts of static across their radios, brief but sharp, always at odd hours, always gone before anyone could properly record them. Someone at the harbor swore the static carried a pattern to it, a rhythm too regular to be random noise, though when I listened to the recording he'd made on his phone, all I heard was a burst of chaotic sound that could have been anything. I didn't tell him what I thought it sounded like. A voice, buried somewhere under the static, speaking too fast and too strange to understand. The animals were the part that unsettled people the most, I think, because it was the part that was hardest to explain away with talk of military tests or faulty equipment. Birds along the coast began flying in patterns that made the local wildlife groups nervous enough to put out public statements, tight, spiraling formations that held for minutes at a time before breaking apart. Dogs in my neighborhood barked at empty stretches of sky for no reason anyone could see. My own neighbor, an elderly woman named Laura Bennett, who lived alone in the house beside mine and kept an old gray cat that rarely left her porch, mentioned to me one evening while I was getting my mail that her cat hadn't slept properly in over a week, pacing the length of the house at all hours, staring at the ceiling like it could see straight through the roof to something beyond. "Probably just a bird got into the attic," she said, though she didn't sound like she believed it, and neither did I. I started reading things online that I probably shouldn't have, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, scrolling through forums full of people from cities and countries I'd never been to, describing experiences that sounded uncomfortably familiar. Strange lights during storms. A feeling of being watched, dreams of dark eyes and low humming sounds. Most of the posts were dismissed by other users as nonsense, mass hysteria, the internet doing what the internet always did with a good story, but a few of them stopped me cold, because the dates lined up almost exactly with the night I'd stood in the rain and handed my umbrella to a frightened, freezing child who wasn't human. One thread in particular kept pulling me back. A user posting from somewhere in another hemisphere described waking that same night to a bright flash outside her window, followed by days of static on every device in her house, and a persistent feeling that something was learning about her, quietly, patiently, from just out of sight. Another user, further down the same thread, described finding strange markings burned faintly into their garden the morning after, gone within a day, as though the ground itself had healed over. I never posted anything myself. I read for hours some nights, jaw tight, coffee going cold beside my keyboard, and then closed the laptop and told myself none of it proved anything, that people saw patterns everywhere if they wanted to badly enough. But I kept the umbrella by my door, unopened, and some nights I found myself glancing at it before I went to sleep, the way you might check that a door was locked. The trucks came in early spring, a little over a month after the storm. I noticed them first on my drive to work, a small convoy parked along the access road that ran behind the harbor, unmarked, gray, with antennae mounted on their roofs that didn't match anything I recognized from the usual utility or telecom vehicles that passed through. Men in plain jackets stood near them some mornings, watching the water through binoculars, saying nothing to anyone who passed. Peter mentioned them too, laughing it off as government surveillance of fishing quotas, some new regulation nobody had bothered to explain properly, and most people at the harbor seemed content with an explanation that mundane. It gave them something ordinary to be annoyed about instead of something they'd have no idea how to process. I wasn't so sure. Once, walking past the convoy on my way to the loading dock, I caught a fragment of conversation between two of the men in plain jackets. Low voices, clipped and professional, the kind of tone people use when they don't want to be overheard. I only caught a handful of words, atmospheric anomaly, containment protocol, before one of them noticed me looking, and the conversation stopped entirely, both men turning to watch me until I was well past them and out of earshot. I didn't mention that to anyone either. Around the same time, the town itself started to feel different in ways I couldn't quite name, a kind of undercurrent of tension that ran beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life. People still went to work, still complained about the weather and the traffic and the price of groceries, but there were more silences in conversations than there used to be. More glances toward the sky during otherwise unremarkable moments, a sense that everyone was waiting for something without being able to say what. I felt it most sharply on nights I couldn't sleep, which had become more frequent than I liked to admit, lying awake and listening to the house settle around me, the umbrella standing silent and strange by my front door, the sky outside my window dark and quiet, and somehow watchful. It was on one of those nights, close to 2 months after the storm, that the sky finally broke its silence again. I was sitting at my kitchen table, unable to sleep, a cup of tea gone cold in front of me, when the lights in my house flickered once, twice, and then died entirely, plunging the kitchen into darkness. I sat very still for a moment, waiting for them to come back the way power outages usually resolve themselves within a minute or two along this stretch of coast. They didn't. Instead, through the window above my sink, I saw the sky outside turn a deep, unnatural green, the color spreading slowly from one horizon toward the other, like ink dropped into water. I stood and moved to the window without quite deciding to, my bare feet cold against the kitchen tile, my breath fogging faintly against the glass. The green light pulsed once, twice, and for a fraction of a second, high above the clouds, I thought I saw a shape, Something vast and dark and utterly still against the glow, gone again before I could be certain I had seen anything at all. The lights in the neighborhood came back on a few seconds later, all at once, the way they might after a brief surge rather than a true outage. My own kitchen lights flickered back to life behind me, and when I looked up at the sky again, it had returned to its ordinary black, scattered with the usual faint stars, as though nothing had happened. I stood at that window for a long time afterward, hands braced against the cool edge of the sink, my heart going harder than it should have for something that had lasted only a handful of seconds. Somewhere down the street, a dog began barking, and didn't stop for a long while. I went back to bed that night, but I didn't sleep, not really. I lay in the dark with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since the storm, I let myself admit, quietly and only to myself, that whatever I had seen that night in the trees had not been an isolated thing, a strange encounter that would fade quietly into memory. It was the beginning of something, and it was getting closer, in ways I couldn't measure but could feel, the way you feel a change in weather pressing against your skin long before the first drop of rain falls. I thought of the small gray hand pressed briefly against mine, the warmth of it, the question in it. I thought of the umbrella standing silent by my door, and of the shape I thought I'd seen against the green light, vast and dark and patient. Whatever was coming, I understood then, without being able to say exactly how I knew it, that it was coming for me specifically, and not simply for the world at large. That thought should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, lying awake in the dark, I found myself thinking of a pair of enormous, dark eyes staring up at me from beneath the edge of an umbrella, and wondering, for the first time, not whether I was in danger, but whether I would recognize her when she came back. The sirens started at 6 in the morning, and I was awake before the first note finished sounding. I don't know what woke me first, the sirens themselves, or some deeper instinct that had been waiting for this moment for weeks, without my conscious mind ever admitting it. I was on my feet and at the window before I had fully processed the sound, and what I saw outside stole whatever breath I had left in my chest. The sky was full of ships. They hung motionless above the town, above the harbor, above the water stretching out toward the horizon, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in a formation so precise it looked less like a fleet and more like a single enormous structure that had simply unfolded itself across the sky overnight. They were dark, matte, swallowing the early morning light rather than reflecting it, and even from that distance, even through the glass of my bedroom window, I could feel a low vibration running through the walls of my house, through the floor beneath my bare feet, a pressure in the air that made my ears ache faintly. For a long moment, I simply stood there, unable to move, unable to fully understand the scale of what I was looking at. The largest of the ships alone seemed to stretch longer than the entire harbor district, its lower hull lost in a haze of distance and cloud, and around it, the smaller vessels, still larger than anything I had ever seen built by human hands, held their positions with a stillness that felt more unsettling than any amount of movement could have. My phone was buzzing on the nightstand, had been buzzing for a while, I realized, message after message piling up from numbers I didn't recognize, alerts from the town's emergency system telling residents to remain calm and await further instructions, though nothing about the tone of the sirens outside suggested calm was an option anyone had. I got dressed without really deciding to, throwing on whatever clothes were closest, and went downstairs on legs that didn't feel entirely like my own. Outside, the street was already filling with people, most still in whatever they'd been wearing when they woke, standing on porches and in driveways with their heads tilted back, staring up at the sky in a silence that felt heavier than the sirens themselves. Laura Bennett was on her porch when I stepped outside, one hand pressed to her chest, the other gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Her cat was nowhere in sight, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked every one of her 70-some years, small and frightened beneath a sky that had never been meant to hold something so vast. "Daniel," she said when she saw me, her voice thin. "Daniel, what is that? What is happening?" I didn't have an answer for her, not one I was ready to give, not with the truth sitting heavy and unspoken in my chest since that night in the storm. "I don't know," I said instead, which was at least half true. "We should get inside, just until we know more." She didn't move, and honestly, neither did I. Not right away, both of us caught in that same paralyzed stillness that seemed to have settled over the entire street. Down the road, someone's car alarm went off for no reason, cutting through the silence, and further away I could hear the low wail of more sirens rising from the direction of the town center, joined a moment later by another sound, deeper, mechanical, that I recognized after a beat as military jets scrambling from somewhere inland. They came in low over the coast a few minutes later, 4 of them, engines screaming, and for one terrible second I thought the worst was about to happen right in front of me, that I was about to watch my town become the site of the first exchange in a war humanity had no chance of winning. The jets banked hard as they approached the fleet, circling wide, clearly probing, clearly waiting for orders from somewhere higher up the chain, and the massive ships above did nothing at all. No weapons fired, no defensive maneuvers. They simply held their position, patient and silent, as though the jets circling below were beneath their notice entirely. That non-reaction was, in its own way, more frightening than an attack would have been. An attack, at least, would have made sense. Silence like this, from something that size, felt like being studied by something that had already decided the outcome and saw no need to rush toward it. The evacuation order came over every phone in the neighborhood within the hour, a flat, mechanical voice instructing residents near the coast to move inland immediately, to avoid main roads where possible, to remain calm. Calm was, by that point, in short supply. The street outside filled with cars within minutes, people loading whatever they could carry into trunks and back seats, children crying, someone a few houses down shouting at their spouse to hurry, the whole scene tipping quickly from silence into a controlled kind of panic that felt like it could tip further at any moment. I helped Laura gather a bag of essentials from her house, moving through her small kitchen and bedroom while she stood frozen in her living room, staring out the window at the sky she could still see through the gap in her curtains. Her hands shook too badly to be useful, so I packed for her medication from the cabinet above her sink, a change of clothes, the framed photograph of a man I assumed was her late husband from the mantel, because I knew without asking that she wouldn't forgive herself for leaving it behind. "They're not attacking," she said quietly as I worked, her voice steadier than I expected. "If they wanted to hurt us, wouldn't they have done it already? Why just sit there?" I didn't have a good answer, though something in the back of my mind, something I hadn't let myself examine too closely in the 2 months since the storm, was already forming a shape I didn't want to look at directly. I thought of the umbrella by my front door. I thought of a small gray hand and a warmth that had passed between us for a single strange second. I said none of it out loud. The roads were worse than either of us expected. What should have been a 15-minute drive inland stretched into over an hour, bumper-to-bumper traffic crawling along the coastal route, while overhead, military helicopters cut back and forth, and further out, at the edge of my vision through the windshield, the fleet remained exactly where it had appeared, unmoved by any of the chaos unfolding beneath it. Radio stations that normally played music had switched entirely to continuous news coverage, voices overlapping from different broadcasts as I flipped between them, trying to piece together some version of the truth from the noise. Officials were urging calm. Officials had no explanation. Officials were in contact with counterparts in other countries who were experiencing identical events, similar fleets appearing over major coastal cities across the globe, all at once, all in the same eerie, motionless silence. It was global. That detail landed heavier than almost anything else I heard that morning, because some small, foolish part of me had still been holding on to the idea that whatever this was, it had something to do specifically with me, with that night in the storm, and that somehow understanding it would make it smaller, more personal, easier to face. Hearing that the entire world was under the same silent watch stripped that comfort away entirely. I was, it seemed, nobody in particular, caught in something far larger than one storm, one child, one umbrella. I got Laura settled at a shelter set up in the high school gymnasium further inland, crowded already with families from along the coast, the air thick with the smell of nervous sweat and bad coffee from an urn someone had wheeled in from the cafeteria. She gripped my hand tightly before I left, harder than I expected from someone her age, and made me promise I would be careful, though careful felt like a word that had lost most of its meaning that morning. I didn't stay at the shelter. I told myself it was because I needed to check on my house, on my car, on the handful of things that still felt like they belonged to an ordinary life I was afraid of losing entirely. The truth, which I only admitted to myself much later, was that some part of me needed to go back toward the coast, toward the fleet, toward whatever answer waited there, even as every rational part of my mind screamed that this was the worst possible decision I could make that day. The roads back toward the coast were emptier than the roads leaving it had been, most people sensibly moving in the opposite direction from me. I passed checkpoints manned by soldiers in full gear, faces tight and serious beneath their helmets, waving cars back the way they'd come. I managed to slip past two of them by taking side streets I knew from years of living in the area, streets too narrow and unremarkable for anyone to have thought to block them yet. By the time I reached my own street, the fleet above had changed. It hadn't moved, not exactly, but something in its formation had shifted, a slow, deliberate reconfiguration that I could feel more than clearly see. Panels of the massive hulls catching light in new ways, faint patterns of illumination tracing along surfaces that had been dark before. And directly above my neighborhood, closer than anywhere else along the coast, a beam of pale light had begun sweeping slowly across the streets below, moving house to house with a patience that made my skin crawl. I parked my car 2 streets away, behind an abandoned delivery van, and made the rest of the way on foot, staying low, staying close to fences and hedges, though I doubted any of that would matter if something up there truly wanted to find me. My own street was empty when I reached it. Every house evacuated, curtains left open, a few doors standing ajar where people had left in too much of a hurry to lock up behind them. The silence was total, broken only by the low, steady hum from above, closer now, heavier, pressing against my eardrums in a way that made my teeth ache. The sweeping beam of light reached my house just as I came around the corner of Laura's hedge, and I stopped dead in the middle of the road, unable to move, watching it pass slowly over the roof, the windows, the front porch, where the umbrella still stood, just inside the door I hadn't thought to lock that morning. The light lingered there, at my house specifically, far longer than it had anywhere else along the street, and I understood, with a certainty that settled into my chest like a stone, that this was not random. A soldier's voice barked from somewhere behind me, sharp and urgent, ordering me to get down, to get back, to move away from the area immediately, and I heard the heavy, mechanical click of a rifle being raised. I didn't move. I couldn't have explained why in that moment, not to the soldier, not to myself. I only knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that whatever was happening above my house was not going to be stopped by a rifle, and that stepping backward now, hiding, running, felt suddenly, deeply wrong. The beam of light above my house pulsed once, twice, and then began to narrow, condensing into something smaller and more defined, a column of pale gold light descending slowly from the vast, silent shape above toward the empty street below. I heard shouting behind me, more soldiers arriving now, radios crackling with urgent, overlapping voices, someone calling for immediate evacuation of the area, someone else asking for permission to fire that never seemed to come. The column of light touched down in the middle of the road, not 10 meters from where I stood frozen, and within it, resolving slowly out of the golden haze, I saw the outline of a small craft settling gently onto the asphalt, no larger than a delivery van, its surface rippling faintly, like the fabric of the umbrella had rippled in my living room weeks before. The soldiers behind me had gone quiet, weapons still raised but no longer shouting, the whole scene suspended in a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. The small craft's surface split along one side without a sound, folding outward like a flower opening, and from within it, a soft golden light spilled out onto the empty street, warm and impossibly gentle against the gray morning around it. For a long moment, nothing emerged. The light simply hung there, waiting, and I found myself taking a single step forward before I could stop myself, ignoring the sharp warning shouted from behind me, my eyes fixed on that open doorway of light and the small shape beginning, slowly, to take form within it. She stepped out of the light, holding my umbrella. I recognized her instantly, even though 2 months had passed, even though she looked different somehow, steadier on her feet, her strange gray skin no longer pale with cold, the faint blue lines along her temples and neck glowing more brightly now, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm that reminded me, oddly, of a heartbeat. She wore something that looked woven rather than sewn, pale silver fabric that shifted faintly in the morning light, and beneath one arm, held carefully against her side the way a child might hold something precious, was my umbrella, its fabric still carrying that same strange oil-on-water sheen it had gained the night it reappeared on my porch. Behind me, I heard one of the soldiers say something low and urgent into his radio, his voice tight with disbelief, and I understood, without turning around, that whatever they had expected to step out of that ship, it had not been this. She looked at the small crowd of soldiers gathered at the edge of the street, weapons still raised, though visibly uncertain now, and then her eyes found mine, and something in her small face changed, a kind of recognition that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. She lifted the umbrella slightly, holding it out toward me across the distance between us, and though she said nothing, though I still didn't know a single word of whatever language she spoke, the gesture needed no translation at all. "It's all right," I said, mostly to the soldiers behind me, though my voice came out rougher than I intended. "I know her. I mean, I've met her before. She's not—" I stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence, unsure what word could possibly follow. Nobody lowered their weapons, but nobody fired either, and in the strange, suspended quiet that followed, I found myself walking forward, slowly, toward the small craft and the child standing in front of it, ignoring the tension radiating from every soldier behind me. She met me halfway, and up close, I could see how much steadier she seemed now than she had that night in the storm, though her eyes still held that same enormous, dark quality that had unsettled and moved me in equal measure the first time I'd seen them. She held the umbrella out with both hands, offering it to me formally, almost ceremonially, and when I took it from her, her fingers brushed against mine for just a moment, and I felt that same faint warmth I remembered, that same strange sense of being read rather than simply touched. "Thank you," I said quietly, because it seemed like the only thing worth saying. "For bringing it back." She tilted her head slightly, the gesture so unmistakably childlike that for a moment I forgot entirely about the massive fleet hanging silent above us, about the soldiers with their weapons still raised, about the sheer scale of whatever was happening around us. She was, in that moment, simply a child who had returned a borrowed thing to someone who had once been kind to her, and the simplicity of that struck me harder than anything else that morning had. That fragile, human moment didn't last long. Behind her, the massive ship above us shifted again, and this time the movement was unmistakable, a section of the enormous hull separating from the whole, descending slowly through the low clouds toward the street, growing larger and larger as it came, until it blotted out most of the pale morning sky above us entirely. The soldiers behind me broke their silence at last, radios crackling with frantic, overlapping voices, someone shouting for backup, someone else demanding to know why nobody had authorized this, and beneath all of it, the low hum from above deepened into something I could feel in my bones. The descending vessel came to rest, hovering just above the street, close enough now that I could see fine details along its dark hull, patterns of light tracing slow, deliberate paths across its surface like veins, and from somewhere within it, a second column of golden light began to form, wider and steadier than the first. The figure that emerged from it was unmistakably the child's mother. I knew it before any word was spoken, before any gesture was made, simply from the way the child beside me straightened, some mixture of pride and caution passing across her small face, and the way every soldier behind me seemed to instinctively take a step backward despite themselves. She was tall, taller than any human I had ever stood near, with the same gray undertone to her skin as her daughter, though hers carried a depth and richness that spoke of age and authority rather than youth. The lines along her temples and throat burned brighter, a deep, steady blue, and her eyes, when they found mine, held a weight that made my knees feel unsteady beneath me, though there was nothing overtly hostile in her expression. If anything, what I saw there looked closer to grief, old and carefully controlled, mixed now with something that might have been relief. She said something, low and resonant, in a language that shaped itself around sounds I had no reference for, but as she spoke, a small device at her collar shimmered faintly, and a voice, calm and measured, translated the words a half-second behind her, layered strangely over her own. "You are the one," the translated voice said, "who found my daughter in the storm." It wasn't quite a question, but I answered as though it was. "Yes," I said, my own voice sounding small against the vast silence pressing down around us. She was cold, scared. I didn't know what she was. I only knew she needed help. The mother's eyes moved to the umbrella, still held loosely in my hand, and something in her expression shifted further, softening in a way that seemed to cost her some effort to allow. "You gave her shelter," she said, the translated words carrying a weight the flat tone couldn't fully convey. "You gave her warmth. You asked for nothing in return, though you did not know what she was, or what danger she might have posed to you." "She was a child," I said simply, because it was the truest thing I could offer. Alone, in the rain, it didn't matter to me what she was. The mother was quiet for a long moment after that, and around us, the soldiers remained frozen, weapons still raised, but clearly uncertain now whether raising them at all had been the right decision from the start. Somewhere far above, I was aware, distantly, that the rest of the fleet remained exactly where it had first appeared, unmoving, patient, and I understood with a growing unease that everything happening on this single, ordinary street was somehow connected to every ship hanging silent over every coastline across the entire world. "You should understand something," the mother said finally, and her voice, even filtered through the flat translation, carried a gravity that made the hair on my arms rise. "My people have encountered many worlds before yours. Many of them greet the stranded and the lost with fear, with violence, with capture and study and cruelty disguised as caution." She paused, and her eyes moved briefly to her daughter before returning to mine. "When my scouting vessel lost contact with my daughter's craft, we prepared for the worst outcome, as we always do. This fleet was assembled and sent toward your world, carrying enough strength to answer any harm done to her in kind." The words settled over me, like cold water, and behind me I heard at least one of the soldiers mutter something under his breath, low and disbelieving. "We did not know what we would find when we arrived," the mother continued. "We were prepared for grief. We were prepared for war, if war was what your world had chosen to offer a frightened, lost child instead of mercy." Her gaze settled fully on me then, steady and unblinking. "Instead, we found her safe, warm, cared for by a single stranger who expected nothing, who told no one, who kept the truth of what he had done quiet rather than seeking any gain from it. We found kindness where we had steeled ourselves for cruelty. I didn't know what to say to that. The weight of what she was describing, an armada capable of ending a war before it began, standing in restraint above an entire planet, because of a single choice made in the rain by someone who hadn't thought twice about it at the time, felt too large to fully hold in my mind all at once. The fleet above your world today, the mother said, was sent prepared to answer harm with equal or greater force. That is the price my people have learned to demand from worlds that meet the vulnerable among us with violence. But it was also sent, always, with the hope that we would find what we found here instead. A single act of decency, offered freely, without knowledge of what it might mean, is worth more to us than any treaty signed under duress ever could be. The child beside me reached out then and took my hand again, more confidently this time, her small fingers wrapping fully around mine, and though I still didn't understand a single word of her own language, I understood the gesture completely. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice unsteady, aware suddenly of just how many people, how many worlds, might be listening to whatever answer came next. The mother's eyes swept briefly across the soldiers still gathered at the edge of the street, their weapons finally, slowly, beginning to lower, and then return to me. "Now," she said, "your world learns what mine already knows, that we do not judge a people by the actions of their governments, or their armies, or their fear. We judge them by moments such as this one, by what a single person chooses to do when no one is watching, and nothing is asked of them in return." Behind her, high above the street, the vast fleet remained motionless against the pale morning sky, patient and silent, no longer merely a threat suspended overhead, but something closer, I understood slowly, to a question still waiting to be fully answered. The mother's gaze held mine a moment longer, steady and unreadable, and then, for the first time since she had stepped from that column of golden light, something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of her expression. "You should prepare yourself, Daniel Hart," she said, my name settling strangely from a voice that had never spoken it before. "The choice you made in the rain, without a single thought of consequence, is about to become known to every person on this world, and to many worlds beyond it who have been waiting a very long time to learn what kind of people you truly are." By evening, my face was on every screen in the world, and I hated it more than I could have imagined possible. The soldiers on my street that morning had been broadcasting, I learned later, not through any choice of their own, but because a small drone hovering near the ship had been feeding a live signal to every network willing to carry it, and by the time the mother's ship rose back into the sky and rejoined the silent fleet above, the footage had already spread further and faster than anything I had ever seen move across the world before. My name, my face, the words spoken on that ordinary, empty street, all of it played on a loop across news channels and phone screens on every continent within hours. I drove back to the shelter to find Laura Bennett in a daze, gathered with dozens of others around a small television mounted in the corner of the gymnasium, the footage playing again and again while a rotating cast of anchors, including Emma Doyle, tried and largely failed to find adequate words for what the world had just witnessed. When Laura saw me walk in, she didn't say anything at first, just crossed the gymnasium floor and pulled me into a hug, fierce enough to surprise me, her thin arms trembling slightly against my back. "You knew," she said quietly, pulling back to look at me, her eyes wet. "That night, months ago, that's what this was about, wasn't it?" I nodded, unable to find better words than that. I didn't think anyone would believe me. "I believe you now," she said, and around us, the gymnasium had gone quiet, dozens of eyes turning slowly toward me as the realization spread through the room that the man on the television screen and the man standing among them were the same person. The days that followed blurred together in a way I still find difficult to describe clearly. The fleet remained in orbit, motionless and patient, while governments around the world scrambled to establish contact, to negotiate, to understand what exactly had happened and what it meant for the future of a species that had, until that week, believed itself entirely alone in the universe. I was pulled into meetings I barely understood, seated across tables from officials whose names I forgot as quickly as they were given to me, all of them asking the same handful of questions in different orders. What had I seen? What had I said? What had she asked of me in return? The truthful answer, that she had asked for nothing at all, seemed to unsettle nearly everyone I spoke to more than any demand would have. Not everyone welcomed what had happened. I understood that early on, though it still stung each time I encountered it directly. There were voices, loud ones, on television and online, and eventually even within the closed meetings I found myself dragged into, who argued that the fleet's continued presence in orbit was itself a threat, regardless of its stated intentions, that restraint shown once did not guarantee restraint shown twice, that humanity had no business trusting a species capable of assembling that much destructive power on the strength of a single storybook encounter between one man and one child. A man named General Colin Ashford led much of that argument within the meetings I attended, a severe, unyielding presence at the head of several briefings, who made it clear from his first words to me that he considered the entire situation a catastrophic security failure rather than the beginning of anything worth calling peace. He didn't trust the mother's restraint. He didn't trust the silence of the fleet. Most of all, he didn't trust that an ordinary dock worker with no military or diplomatic training had somehow become the single point of contact through which the fate of every person on the planet was now being weighed. I couldn't entirely blame him for that distrust, even as it frightened me to sit across from him and hear him speak, in careful, measured language, about contingency plans and defensive postures that sounded, beneath the polished phrasing, uncomfortably close to the very violence the mother had described worlds meeting the vulnerable with. The confrontation came on the 5th day, in an underground command facility I was escorted into without much explanation, summoned there in the middle of the night by officials who wouldn't tell me why until I arrived. Ashford was waiting in a briefing room lit by the cold glow of monitors, several other officers gathered around a table displaying live feeds from installations positioned near the coast, and it took me only a moment to understand what I was looking at. Missile batteries, quietly repositioned over the preceding days, aimed not at the massive fleet still hanging patient and unmoving above the horizon, but at a smaller vessel, the child's own scouting craft, which had returned quietly to the same empty street days earlier to allow for what officials had called, in careful diplomatic language, a continued exchange of goodwill. She was there again that night, I realized with a cold jolt, sitting somewhere within that small ship, waiting for a scheduled meeting between her mother and a delegation of world leaders that Ashford's plan would shatter beyond any hope of repair. "You can't do this," I said, my voice shaking with an anger I hadn't fully felt until that moment. "She's a child. If you fire on that ship, whatever chance we have at anything better than fear and distrust between us and them is gone. Forever." Ashford didn't look away from the monitors. "And if this is exactly the kind of vulnerability they've been waiting for," he said, his voice flat and controlled, "then every day we hesitate is a day closer to losing whatever advantage a first strike might still offer us. Restraint shown once is not evidence of restraint that will hold." "She gave me nothing but kindness," I said, stepping closer, despite the officers around the table tensing at the movement. "Her mother assembled that entire fleet, ready to answer cruelty with force, and instead of attacking us, she's sitting up there waiting, patiently, hoping we prove ourselves worth more than that." You want to be the reason that hope dies. For a long, tense moment, nobody in that room spoke. Ashford's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the monitor, displaying the small, unremarkable shape of the scouting vessel sitting quiet on an empty street, no different in size or threat from the moment it had first landed there days earlier. "Sir," one of the younger officers said finally, quietly, into the silence, If this goes forward without direct authorization from civilian leadership, and it goes wrong, there won't be a fleet left up there to negotiate with. There won't be anything left to negotiate. It was, in the end, not my words that stopped him, though I would like to believe they mattered at least a little. It was the arrival, minutes later, of a call from higher up the chain than even Ashford answered to, ordering the batteries stood down immediately, the decision having reached ears far above that underground room once word had somehow, through channels I never fully understood, made its way out of that facility and into the hands of people determined not to let one general's distrust unravel what the rest of the world was still, carefully, trying to build. I never learned exactly how that word had traveled so quickly. I suspected, though I never confirmed it, that the mother's people had simply been listening the entire time, patient and watchful, the way they had been from the very beginning. The formal treaty was signed 3 weeks later, in a ceremony broadcast to every corner of the world, delegates from dozens of nations standing together on a stage that felt too small for the size of what was being decided upon it. I stood near the back for most of it, uncomfortable in a suit I'd been given for the occasion, watching leaders I had only ever seen on television sign documents establishing humanity's first tentative steps into a much larger community than anyone had previously imagined existing. Afterward, away from the cameras and the crowd, I was brought once more to the small, unremarkable street where all of it had begun, and found the child waiting for me there, sitting on the curb outside my own front porch, with my umbrella resting across her knees, turning it slowly in her small hands like she was still trying to understand exactly what it was that had mattered so much about it. I sat down beside her without a word, the evening quiet and ordinary in a way that felt almost impossible after everything that had happened since the last time I'd sat on this street. She looked up at me, and this time, when she spoke, the small translation device at her collar carried her words clearly. "My name is Sayla," she said. "I never told you before." "Sayla," I repeated, and something about finally having a name for her settled a small, unresolved ache I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying since that first night in the rain. "It's good to finally meet you properly." She smiled then, small and genuine, and held the umbrella out toward me once more, though this time I understood the gesture differently, not a returning of something borrowed, but an offering, freely given. "Keep it," she said. "My mother says it should stay with you. She says it is a reminder, for both our peoples, of what a single kindness is capable of becoming." I took the umbrella from her, turning it slowly in my own hands, feeling the strange, shifting weight of the fabric beneath my fingers, and found myself, for the first time in weeks, entirely at peace with everything that had happened. I think back often now to that night in the storm, to the version of myself who nearly kept driving, who nearly told himself that whatever strange light he'd seen in the trees was none of his business, and I wonder sometimes how close the world came to a very different story. I didn't do anything I would call remarkable that night. I saw someone small and frightened and cold, and I did the only thing that felt right to do, without a single thought of what it might mean beyond that moment. It turned out that was exactly the point. Not the size of the act, but the honesty of it, offered freely, in the dark, with no one watching and nothing expected in return. The fleet is gone from our skies now, returned to wherever it came from, though Sayla's people remain in contact, careful and patient, teaching us slowly what it means to be part of something far larger than the world we grew up believing was the whole of everything. Some days, it still feels impossible to believe any of it happened at all, that an umbrella given away in the rain on an unremarkable night could have opened a door this wide. But I keep it by my front door still, exactly where it has always stood, and some evenings, when the weather turns and the sky darkens with the promise of rain, I find myself glancing toward the horizon, wondering, quietly and without fear, what small kindness might be waiting out there for someone else to offer, and what it might one day come to mean.